While the city's ruthless elite toasted champagne in the living room they stole from her, Sarah Jenkins was left to freeze on the streets of Chicago. But her enemies made one fatal mistake. They underestimated who was watching. From sleeping in a rusted sedan to holding the keys to an empire that now terrifies the very people who stripped her of her dignity, Sarah's journey is not just about wealth, it's about cold-blooded retribution. In a city run by old money and sharks, this is how the Queen of the South Loop rose from the ashes to exact a revenge that cost everything. The rain in Chicago doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grit stick harder. Sarah Jenkins stood on the sidewalk of West Wacker Drive, the water soaking through her thin cardigan, plastering her hair to her forehead. Beside her sat 2 trash bags. That was it. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of building a life, 10 years of supporting a man's dreams, reduced to 2 hefty bags filled with second-hand clothes and a toothbrush. She looked up at the 42nd floor of the glass spire she used to call home. The lights were on. She could see the silhouette of a man standing by the window, Richard, and then a second silhouette joined him. Slender, poised, holding a wine glass. Jessica. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She felt a cold, hollow numbness spreading from her chest to her fingertips. Just 3 hours ago, she had walked into that penthouse with groceries for dinner. She had bought Richard's favorite ribeye steaks, dry-aged. He had been sitting on the Italian leather sofa, the one Sarah had spent months saving for, back when his startup was just a terrifying idea in a basement. He hadn't looked up from his phone when he said it. "It's over, Sarah. You need to leave." She had laughed, thinking it was a joke. Richard had a dark sense of humor. Very funny. "Do you want potatoes or asparagus?" "I'm not joking." He finally looked at her then. His eyes, usually warm and crinkling at the corners, were dead, flat, like a shark that had smelled blood and lost interest. "My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, has already emailed you the details. The prenup you signed, the clause about lifestyle incompatibility, it's triggered." "Prenup? Richard? We signed that on a napkin when we had $40 in the bank. It's not valid. We ratified it 3 years ago. Remember, when I transferred the company assets? You signed the papers without reading them, Sarah. You always were too trusting. That's why we don't work anymore. I need a partner, not a dependent." Then Jessica walked in. Jessica Vane, Sarah's best friend from college, the woman who had been the maid of honor at their wedding. The woman Sarah had comforted through 3 breakups. Jessica was wearing Sarah's silk robe, the one Richard had bought her for their anniversary. "Sorry, sweetie," Jessica said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Richard and I, well, we just make sense. Power attracts power. You understand, don't you? You were always more of a background character." The security guards, men, Sarah, had baked cookies for at Christmas, escorted her out like a criminal. Now, standing in the rain, Sarah checked her phone. A notification from Bank of America popped up. Account ending in 4,490, overdrawn, $-45. He had drained the joint account, every cent. She dialed her mother's number, her fingers trembling. It went to voicemail. She dialed her sister. Voicemail. Then she remembered Richard had paid for her sister's rehab. He had paid off her mother's mortgage. He owned them, too. A black Mercedes SUV splashed a wave of dirty gutter water onto her legs as it sped past. She gasped, the cold shock finally breaking her paralysis. She grabbed the wet trash bags. She had nowhere to go. No friends who weren't Richard's friends. No family who wouldn't side with the checkbook. She walked. She walked until the expensive high-rises of the Loop gave way to the darker, grittier streets of the South Side. She found a 2-4-hour laundromat with a flickering neon sign. The attendant, an older man with a scar running down his cheek, looked up from his newspaper. "You washin' or loiterin'?" he grunted. I just need to dry off," Sarah whispered. He looked at her wet clothes, the expensive but ruined shoes, the trash bags. He softened, just a fraction. "Sit in the back. Don't make noise." Sarah sat on a plastic yellow chair, the hum of the dryers, the only thing drowning out the screaming in her head. She closed her eyes and saw Richard's face. The cruelty of it. It wasn't just a breakup, it was an execution. He wanted her erased. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the only thing the security guard had let her keep besides her phone. A crumpled receipt from the grocery store. She stared at it. Ribeye steak, $45. Total, $45. That steak cost more than she had to her name. I will kill him, she whispered to the empty laundromat. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a vow of destruction. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I will bury him. But vows don't pay for hotels. As the sun began to rise, gray and bleak over the city, Sarah Jenkins, formerly the wife of Chicago's brightest tech mogul, walked out of the laundromat to start her new life as a homeless woman. 3 months later, survival is a habit you learn fast. Sarah learned that the public library on State Street had the cleanest bathrooms. She learned that if you went to the Panera Bread on Jackson just before closing, the manager, a kindly kid named Leo, would give you the expired bagels instead of throwing them out. She had sold her wedding ring at a pawn shop on day 3. The pawnbroker, a man named Saul, who smelled like stale cigars, had looked at the 2-carat diamond with a jeweler's loop. It's a fake, he had said, tossing it onto the glass counter. Excuse me? Sarah felt the room spin. That cost $15,000. It's cubic zirconia, lady. Good quality, but glass. The band is gold, though. I'll give you $50 for the gold. Richard. He had swapped the diamond. Or maybe he had never bought a real one to begin with. The humiliation burned hotter than the hunger in her belly. She took the $50. She bought a prepaid phone card and a gym membership at a cheap 2-4-hour chain, just so she could shower. She was working now, under the table, dishwashing at a greasy spoon diner called Sal's Pit near the rail yards. The owner, Sal, paid her in cash, way below minimum wage, but he didn't ask for an address she didn't have. Her hands, once manicured and soft, were red, chapped, and covered in burns from the industrial sanitizer. Her hair was chopped short. She had done it herself, with kitchen scissors, in the gym bathroom to stop it from tangling. It was a Tuesday, the lunch rush. The diner was packed with construction workers and truck drivers. Sarah was elbow-deep in greasy water when Sal kicked the kitchen door open. Sarah, someone here for you. Front booth. Sarah froze. For me? Nobody knows I'm here. Suit. Looks like a Fed or a lawyer. Don't get me in trouble, you hear? Sarah wiped her hands on her stained apron. Panic spiked in her chest. Had Richard found her? Was he trying to sue her for something? She walked out into the dining area. Sitting in the corner booth, looking wildly out of place among the ketchup-stained tables, was a man in a charcoal-gray 3-piece suit. He was elderly, perhaps in his 70s, with silver hair slicked back and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a sharp nose. He had a leather briefcase on the table, shielding it from a sticky spot. Sarah approached slowly. I'm Sarah. The man stood up. His movements were precise. Mrs. Sarah Jenkins? Just Sarah. I don't use that name anymore. My name is Silas Graves, the man said. His voice was like dry parchment. I am the senior partner at Graves, O'Malley, and Associates. I have been looking for you for 6 weeks, Sarah. You are a difficult woman to find. I don't owe anyone money, Sarah said defensively, crossing her arms. If Richard sent you, Mr. Sterling did not send me, Silas said, his lip curling slightly at the name. In fact, Mr. Sterling is the reason I had such trouble locating you. He told the inquiries board you had moved to. Bali. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Bali. Right. Please, sit. Silas gestured to the cracked vinyl seat opposite him. Sarah sat. What do you want? Silas opened the briefcase. He pulled out a thick document bound in blue, heavy stock paper. Does the name Arthur Pellington mean anything to you? Sarah frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar, like a memory from a different lifetime. Pellington. Wasn't he that old man Richard tried to secure funding from years ago? The railway tycoon? Richard said he was a senile old bat who threw him out of his office. Mr. Pellington was many things, Silas said. eccentric, difficult, reclusive, but he was not senile. He passed away 2 months ago. I'm sorry, Sarah said automatically, but what does that have to do with me? I met him once, for 5 minutes. I poured him a cup of tea while he yelled at Richard. He remembered that tea, Silas said. He pulled a smaller envelope from the briefcase, and he remembered what you did after. Sarah racked her brain. I walked him to the elevator. It was raining. He didn't have an umbrella. I gave him mine. Richard screamed at me later for it, because it was a brand name umbrella. Silas smiled, a rare, thin expression. Precise. Mr. Pellington often tested people. He believed that character is shown not when people are watching, but when you think no one cares. He despised your ex-husband. He called him a soulless calculator. He wasn't wrong, Sarah muttered. Mr. Pellington had no living family. He hated the board of directors of his company, Pellington Industries. He spent the last decade of his life looking for an heir, someone who knew the value of a dollar, and more importantly, the value of dignity. Silas slid the document across the sticky table. Sarah, Arthur Pellington has left you his entire estate. The diner went silent, or maybe Sarah just went deaf. The clatter of plates, the sizzling of bacon, the shouting of Sal, it all dropped away. I don't understand, she stammered. His estate? You mean like his house? I mean everything, Silas corrected. The Pellington Manor in Lake Forest, the real estate portfolio in downtown Chicago, the majority shareholder controlling interest in Pellington Industries, and his personal liquidity. How much? Silas leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. After taxes, the liquid assets sit at roughly $480 million. The total asset value is in the billions. Sarah grabbed the edge of the table. The room tilted. She thought she might vomit. Billions? However, Silas held up a finger. There is a condition, a twist, as Arthur liked to call it. He loved games. Sarah stared at him. Of course, there was always a catch. What is it? You cannot access the bulk of the funds for 6 months. For the next 6 months, you are given a stipend of $5,000 a week and access to the manor. You must enter Chicago high society. You must take his seat at the board meetings. And you must do it without Richard Sterling knowing you are the heir. If Richard Sterling finds out the source of your money before the 6 months are up, the inheritance is voided and goes to charity. Why? Sarah whispered. Because Silas's eyes gleamed with a cold, hard light. Arthur knew Richard would destroy you. He kept tabs on you. He knew about the divorce before it hit the papers. This money isn't just a gift, Sarah. It's a weapon. Arthur wants you to use the next 6 months to build the power to crush him, but you must do it as a mystery woman. You must make Richard fear you before he knows it's you. Sarah looked down at her red, chapped hands. She looked at the greasy apron. She thought about the 2 trash bags that held her entire life. She looked up at Silas. The fear was gone. In its place was something cold, something sharp. Where do I sign? The first thing Sarah did was not scream or cry or faint. She finished her shift at Sal's pit. She scrubbed the last grease trap, wiped down the stainless steel counter, and untied her filthy apron. Sal looked up from his ledger as she walked to the front. Leaving early? I'm docking your pay. Keep it, Sarah said. She placed the apron on the counter. And keep the tips. You'll need them to hire someone who won't tolerate your yelling. She walked out the door, leaving Sal with his mouth open, a half-lit cigar tumbling onto his shirt. Outside, a black town car was waiting. Not a flashy limousine, but a heavy, armored Lincoln Continental. Silas Graves held the door open. He didn't look at her grease-stained jeans or her ruined shoes. He looked only at her eyes. Where are we going? Sarah asked, sliding into the leather interior that smelled of cedar and old money. To Lake Forest, Silas replied, signaling the driver. To Pellington Manor. It is time to erase the last 3 months, Sarah, and perhaps the last 10 years. The drive took an hour. They left the grime of the city behind. Passing through the gilded gates of the North Shore, Pellington Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of limestone and ivy, sitting on 5 acres of manicured lawn that looked like green velvet. As the car crunched over the gravel driveway, Sarah felt a wave of nausea. I don't belong here, Silas. I'm a dishwasher. My husband, ex-husband, said I was nothing. Arthur Pellington was born a coal miner's son, Silas said sharply. He didn't believe in bloodlines. He believed in fire. You have been burned, Sarah. Now you are hardened. The staff was waiting in the foyer. There were only 3 of them. Arthur hadn't liked crowds. There was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, a woman with a face like carved granite. There was Thomas, the groundskeeper, who looked strong enough to wrestle a bear. And there was a young woman named Chloe, the personal assistant Arthur had hired 2 weeks before he died. This is Mrs. Jenkins, Silas announced. Miss Hart, Sarah corrected him, her voice trembling slightly before finding its footing. My maiden name is Hart. I will use that from now on. Mrs. Higgins stepped forward. Her eyes scanned Sarah's cheap clothes, the choppy haircut, the red, raw hands. There was no judgment, only assessment. Very well, Miss Hart. The master's instructions were clear. We serve the holder of the key, and you hold it. I need a bath, Sarah said, her voice quiet, and I need to burn these clothes. I have already prepared the incinerator, Mrs. Higgins said dryly. That night, Sarah lay in a bathtub the size of a small swimming pool. The water was hot, scented with eucalyptus and sandalwood. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink. She looked at her hands. The scars from the dishwater were fading, but the calluses remained. Good, she thought. Let them stay. Let them remind me. The next morning, the work began. Silas didn't let her rest. He arrived at 6 a.m. with a stack of binders. Richard Sterling is not just a man, Silas explained, pacing the library while Sarah drank black coffee. He is a brand. He has built his reputation on being the future of tech. But his financials are shaky. He is over-leveraged. He needs to acquire Pellington Industries to save his own company, Sterling Dynamics. He has been trying to buy Arthur's company for years. He wants Pellington Industries? Sarah asked, flipping through a file. Desperately. He thinks the company is currently leaderless. He thinks he can swoop in and buy it for pennies on the dollar from a confused heir. That is where you come in. I can't run a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, Silas. I planned charity dinners. I matched curtains. You managed the household of a narcissist for a decade without losing your mind, Silas countered. You have more political instinct than you realize, but you need armor. For the next 4 weeks, Sarah didn't leave the estate. Chloe, the assistant, proved to be a genius with aesthetics. She brought in a team stylists, dermatologists, posture coaches, but this wasn't about looking pretty. Richard likes pretty things, Sarah told the stylist, a sharp-eyed Frenchman named Jean-Luc. He likes soft, pliable things. I don't want to look like that. Then we make you look like a blade, Jean-Luc said. They cut her hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed her jawline like a helmet. They dyed it a deep, midnight black, erasing the soft brown Richard had loved. They dressed her in structured blazers, high-collared silk shirts, and stilettos that sounded like gunshots on the marble floor. She learned to walk differently, not the apologetic shuffle of a wife, trying not to disturb her husband, but the long, predatory stride of a woman who owns the ground beneath her feet. Silas drilled her on the financials. She learned the Pellington portfolio backward and forward. She learned about hostile takeovers, poison pills, and leveraged buyouts. By the end of the month, Sarah stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her cheekbones looked sharper. Her eyes were cold, framed by dark liner. She wore a tailored crimson suit that cost more than Richard's car. Are you ready? Silas asked from the doorway. No, Sarah said. She turned to face him. But Sarah Jenkins is dead, and Sarah Hart is ready to go hunting. Good, Silas smiled. Because Richard Sterling is hosting the gala for the future tonight at the Ritz-Carlton, and Pellington Industries has just purchased a platinum table. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom was a sea of black ties and glittering diamonds. It was the kind of event Richard lived, for a room full of people pretending to care about charity while desperately trying to out-network each other. Richard Sterling stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne in hand. He looked exactly the same as the day he had thrown Sarah out. Handsome, charming, and utterly hollow. Jessica was on his arm, wearing a silver dress that shimmered like fish scales. She was laughing too loudly at a joke made by the mayor. "We're going to close the Pellington deal next week," Richard was saying to a group of investors. "The old man is dead, and the lawyers are scrambling. I'll pick the carcass clean before summer." "You always win, Richard," Jessica cooed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I do," Richard smirked. "It's a law of nature." The ballroom doors opened. Usually, late arrivals tried to slip in unnoticed. This arrival was different. The heavy oak doors swung wide, and the chatter in the room died down, rippling into silence from the entrance inward. Sarah walked in. She was wearing emerald green, not a soft pastel, but a deep, venomous green velvet gown that hugged her frame and pooled on the floor behind her. The back was open, revealing the sharp lines of her shoulder blades. Around her neck was the Pellington tier, a 20-carat emerald necklace that Arthur had bought from a Russian countess in the 50s. It hadn't been seen in public for 40 years. She didn't look at the floor. She looked straight ahead, her chin lifted. Silas walked a step behind her, like a shadow guard. "Who is that?" someone whispered near Richard. Richard frowned, squinting. I don't know." Sarah felt the eyes on her. The old panic flared in her gut, the fear of being judged, of being wrong. She crushed it. She imagined the cold rain on Wacker Drive. She imagined the smell of the trash bags. She walked straight to table 1, the platinum table reserved for Pellington Industries. It was directly across from Richard's table. She sat, her movements fluid and precise. A waiter rushed over. "Sparkling water," she said. Her voice was an octave lower than it used to be. Controlled. Richard couldn't look away. He excused himself from the mayor and walked over, Jessica trailing behind him, looking annoyed at the competition. "I don't believe we've met," Richard said, putting on his best billionaire charm smile. He extended a hand. "Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics." Sarah didn't stand. She didn't take his hand. She slowly turned her head and looked him up and down, as if he were a waiter who had brought the wrong order. "I know who you are, Mr. Sterling," she said coolly. Richard faltered. He wasn't used to being ignored. "And you are?" "I am representing the Pellington Trust," Sarah said. "My name is Miss Hart." "Hart?" Richard's brow furrowed. The name was common, but something about her voice, something about the shape of her jaw. "Pellington?" Jessica interjected, her eyes narrowing. "I thought that company was dissolving." Richard said he was buying it. Sarah shifted her gaze to Jessica. She looked at the silver dress, then at the cheap diamond bracelet on Jessica's wrist, a gift Richard had probably recycled from an old girlfriend. "Mr. Sterling says a lot of things," Sarah said, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "I'm afraid he is misinformed. Pellington Industries is not for sale. In fact, we are looking to expand." Richard laughed, a nervous, barking sound. "Expand? The company is a dinosaur. It needs new leadership. I'm actually preparing a formal offer for the board next week." "Save your paper, Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, picking up her water glass. "We aren't interested in acquiring debt-ridden startups." The insult landed like a slap. Richard's face went red. "Excuse me? My company is the leader in—" "Your company," Sarah interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he and Jessica could hear, "is 3 months away from insolvency. You're over-leveraged on the Asian expansion, and your R&D department hasn't produced a patent in 2 years. You need Pellington's cash reserves to pay your loans." Richard went pale. "How? How do you know that?" "I do my homework," Sarah said. She turned back to the stage, dismissing him. "Enjoy the gala, Richard. Try not to spend money you don't have." Richard stood there, frozen. He looked at her profile, the sharp nose, the dark hair. "Do I know you?" he whispered. "You look familiar." Sarah turned one last time. She looked him dead in the eyes. For a second, she let the mask slip, just a fraction. She let him see the brown eyes of the wife he had betrayed. "I just have one of those faces," she said. "The kind people forget easily, until it's too late." Before he could respond, the auctioneer banged his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The first item up for bid is a rare 19th century landscape by Turner. Opening bid is $500,000. Richard stumbled back to his seat, looking shaken. "What was that about?" Jessica hissed. "I don't know," Richard muttered, drinking his champagne in one gulp. "She knows too much. We need to find out who she is." "She's just a glorified secretary for a dead man," Jessica scoffed. "Watch this. I want that painting. Buy it for me." 500,000. Richard raised his paddle, eager to regain his dominance. 600,000. A man in the back called out. 700, Richard yelled. He looked at Jessica and winked. 700 going once, the auctioneer called. Sarah didn't look at Richard. She simply raised her hand, holding her paddle with 2 fingers. 1 million, she said clearly. The room gasped. The jump was aggressive. Richard glared at her back. 1,100,000. Sarah didn't hesitate. 2 million. Jessica grabbed Richard's arm. "Richard, stop. We can't afford 2 million for a painting." "I'm not letting her win," Richard hissed. His ego was bruised. 2,100,000. Sarah turned her head slightly. She caught Richard's eye. She smiled a terrifying, pitying smile. 3 million, she said. The room went silent. 3 million was absurd for a minor Turner. It was a power move, pure and simple. Richard's hand twitched on his paddle. He knew he didn't have the liquidity. If he bid 3-1, his CFO would have a heart attack. He lowered his hand, defeated, sold, for $3 million to the lady in green. As the applause broke out, Sarah didn't clap. She just took a sip of water. She had just spent a fortune of Arthur's money on a painting she didn't even like. But the look on Richard Sterling's face, that was priceless. Silas leaned in, whispering, "A bold opening move, Miss Hart, but you have poked the bear. He will come for you now." "Let him come," Sarah whispered back, watching Richard storm out of the ballroom with Jessica trailing behind him. "I'm counting on it." The morning after the gala, Richard Sterling didn't go to the office. He went to a basement bar in the West Loop, a place that didn't have a sign, just a heavy steel door. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and desperation. Sitting in a booth was a man named Cole. Cole wasn't a lawyer. He was a consultant for problems that lawyers couldn't legally touch. "I want everything on her," Richard hissed, sliding an envelope of cash across the table. "Sarah Hart. She claims to be representing the Pellington Trust. I want to know where she sleeps, who she banks with, and what dirt I can use to strangle her." Cole counted the money. "Pellington is big game, Mr. Sterling. If she's the face of the trust, she's protected." "Everyone has a weakness," Richard snapped. "Find hers. She embarrassed me last night. Nobody does that." Across town, in the sunlit library of Pellington Manor, Silas Graves placed a cup of tea in front of Sarah. "He has hired Cole Verify," Silas said calm. "A bottom feeder investigator. Predictable." Sarah didn't look up from the spreadsheets. "Let him dig. What will he find?" "He will find exactly what we planted," Silas said, allowing a rare, thin smile. "According to the digital trail we created last week, Sarah Hart is the estranged granddaughter of a European textile magnate. She grew up in boarding schools in Zurich, spent her 20s in humanitarian work in Africa, and is notoriously private. There are no photos of her before 2024 because she wiped her digital footprint for security reasons." "And the resemblance?" Sarah asked, touching her own face. "People see what they expect to see," Silas said. "Richard sees a wealthy, arrogant European heiress because that is what he fears. He doesn't see his ex-wife because, to him, Sarah Jenkins is trash. He doesn't look at trash. He will when the trash takes his company," Sarah murmured. 3 days later, the trap was set. Richard, emboldened by the fake dossier Cole had provided. "She's just a trust fund baby, boss. Never ran a business in her life. She's just a figurehead," decided to crash the quarterly board meeting of Pellington Industries. As a minority shareholder, He had bought 2% of the stock years ago. Just to annoy Arthur, he had the right to sit in. The boardroom was a cavern of mahogany and glass. 12 board members sat around the table, looking nervous. They knew the company was in transition. They didn't know the new chairwoman well. Richard strode in like he owned the building. Jessica was with him, carrying a notepad, acting the part of the devoted executive VP. "Good morning, gentlemen," Richard boomed. "I thought I'd stop by. I hear there's a leadership vacuum." The door at the head of the table opened. Sarah walked in. She wore a charcoal gray suit, severe and sharp. She didn't look at Richard. She sat at the head of the table. "There is no vacuum, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice icy. "But there is a dress code, and typically, we require an invitation." Richard laughed, pulling out a chair. "I own stock, Miss Hart. I have a right to be here. In fact, I have a proposal. Sterling Dynamics is prepared to offer a buyout of the Pellington Logistics Division. It's bleeding money. I'll take it off your hands for, let's say, 40 million. It was a lowball offer, an insult. He was testing her. Sarah opened a folder in front of her. The logistics division generated a 12% profit last quarter. But speaking of bleeding money, Mr. Sterling, she pulled out a single sheet of paper. "How is the Project Orion initiative going?" Richard froze. The room went deadly silent. Jessica dropped her pen. Project Orion was Richard's secret, off-the-books gamble. He had funneled $20 million of company funds into a cryptocurrency scheme in the Caymans, hoping for a quick return to cover his losses. It had crashed. If the SEC found out, he would go to prison. I don't know what you're talking about," Richard stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip. "Don't you?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes boring into his skull. She knew about Orion because she had found the bank statements in his jacket pocket 6 months ago, before he kicked her out. She had tried to ask him about it then, and he had screamed at her for snooping. "It would be a shame," Sarah continued, tapping a fingernail on the paper, "if the Securities and Exchange Commission decided to audit that specific account in the Cayman Islands, the one ending in 7,789. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. She had the account number. "What do you want?" he whispered, his bravado gone. "I want you to sit down and be quiet," Sarah said. "And if you ever interrupt my board meeting again with a lowball offer, I will fax this sheet to the Department of Justice." Richard sat. He didn't speak for the next 2 hours. He just stared at Sarah, terrified and confused. As they left the meeting, Jessica grabbed Richard's arm in the elevator. Her nails dug into his suit jacket. "Richard," she hissed, "how did she know about Orion? Only you and I know about that." "I don't know," Richard shouted, punching the elevator wall. "She must have a spy in my office. Cole said she was clean." "She's not clean," Jessica said, her eyes narrowing. She knew exactly where to hit. She didn't look at the papers, Richard. She recited that account number from memory. "I saw her." "So?" "So," Jessica whispered, a cold realization dawning on her. "She moves like she's been in your house. She smells like lavender." "What?" "Nothing," Jessica said, shaking her head. But her mind was racing. Sarah Jenkins had always worn lavender lotion. Cheap, drugstore lavender. This Miss Hart wore expensive perfume, but the base note, it was the same. "We need to meet her," Jessica said firmly. "Private ground. No lawyers. Just us and her." "Why?" "Because," Jessica said, checking her reflection in the polished brass doors, "I want to see her hands." The invitation arrived the next morning. "Mr. Sterling requests the pleasure of Miss Hart's company for a private dinner at the Onyx Room to discuss a truce." "It's a trap," Silas said, reading the heavy cardstock. "Of course it is," Sarah said, applying a dark, blood-red lipstick in the mirror. "He wants to isolate me. He thinks he can charm me, or bully me, if there are no witnesses." "The Onyx Room is soundproof," Silas warned. "It is where the Chicago elite go to bury bodies metaphorically." "I'm not going there to bury a body, Silas," Sarah said, standing up and smoothing her dress. It was black, backless, and dangerous. "I'm going there to sign a contract." "The merger?" Silas asked. The surrender, Sarah corrected. The onyx room was dimly lit, smelling of cigars and leather. Richard and Jessica were already seated at a corner booth, a bottle of Dom Perignon on ice. When Sarah arrived, Richard stood up. He looked tired. The circles under his eyes were dark. The fear of the SEC audit was eating him alive. Miss Hart, Richard said, his voice strained. Thank you for coming. I have an hour, Sarah said, sitting down. She didn't smile. Jessica watched her like a hawk. You look lovely, Miss Hart. That dress. Is it vintage? Custom, Sarah lied smoothly. Let's cut the chase, Richard said, pouring the champagne. His hand shook slightly. You have me over a barrel with the Orion file. I don't know how you got it, but you win. I want to make a deal. I'm listening, Sarah said. I need capital, Richard admitted. It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. Sterling Dynamics is tight on cash. I need a loan from the Pellington Trust. 50 million. Short term. And what do I get? Sarah asked, sipping her water. I will give you a seat on my board, Richard said. And I will give you the deed to my penthouse in the Loop as collateral. The penthouse. The home Sarah had been thrown out of. The place where she had cooked his meals and washed his clothes. The penthouse isn't enough, Sarah said. It's worth 10 million, Richard protested. I don't want your house, Richard, Sarah said softly. I want your legacy. She reached into her purse and pulled out a document. It was thick, bound in leather. This is a partnership agreement, she explained. The Pellington Trust will inject $100 million into Sterling Dynamics. It will save your company. It will cover your Orion mess. Richard's eyes lit up. 100 million? That solves everything. However, Sarah continued, sliding the contract across the table, there is a clause. Clause 14B. If Sterling Dynamics stock drops below a certain threshold, say $10 a share, for more than 24 hours, the Pellington Trust assumes full executive control of your company. We take 51% of the shares. Automatically. Richard laughed. My stock is trading at $45. It hasn't been below $30 in 5 years. That clause is meaningless. Then you should have no problem signing it, Sarah challenged. Richard looked at Jessica. Jessica was frowning. She was looking at Sarah's hands. Sarah was resting them on the table. They were manicured now, the nails painted a deep burgundy, but on the side of her left thumb, there was a tiny, faint, white line. A scar. Jessica remembered that scar. Sarah had gotten it from a kitchen knife while cutting limes for Richard's gin and tonic 3 years ago. Jessica had been there. She had put the Band-Aid on it. Jessica's breath hitched. She looked at Sarah's eyes. The contact lenses were colored slightly gray, but the shape. Richard, Jessica whispered. Don't sign it. Why? Richard hissed. It's free money. The stock will never drop that low. We're launching the new phone next month. It'll go up to $60. Richard, look at her, Jessica said, her voice rising in panic. Look at her hands. Richard glanced at Sarah's hands. Nice manicure. So what? It's her, Jessica said, staring at Sarah with horror. It's Sarah. Richard froze. He looked at Miss Hart. He looked at the woman he had discarded. Sarah didn't flinch. She stared right back at Jessica. She didn't deny it. She just raised an eyebrow, a gesture of pure arrogance. Your girlfriend seems paranoid, Mr. Sterling, Sarah said coolly. Perhaps the stress is getting to her. Do you want the money, or should I leave? It's not her, Jess, Richard scoffed, turning back to the contract. Sarah is begging for change on a street corner somewhere. This is a shark. Sarah was a mouse. Richard uncapped his fountain pen. I'm signing. I'm taking the money, I'm fixing Orion, and then I'm going to buy you out of this contract in 6 months. I look forward to it, Sarah said. Jessica reached out to grab the pen. Richard, no, it's a trap. If she's Sarah, she knows about the supply chain failure. She knows the new phone isn't ready. Richard shoved Jessica's hand away. Shut up. You're drunk. He signed. The ink was dark and permanent. Richard Sterling, CEO. Sarah waited until he finished the last loop of his signature. She reached out and took the contract. She closed the folder. The sound was like a coffin lid slamming shut. "Thank you, Richard," Sarah said. She stood up. "Now," Richard said, leaning back, looking relieved, "transfer the funds tomorrow, and maybe we can have dinner again, without the lawyers?" Sarah looked down at him. She looked at Jessica, who was pale and trembling. "Actually," Sarah said, checking her watch, "I have one more meeting tonight, with the press." "The press? Why?" "To announce that Pellington Industries has just dumped its entire holding of cobalt futures," Sarah said. Richard stopped breathing. "What?" "Sterling Dynamics relies on cobalt for your batteries," Sarah explained, her voice devoid of emotion. "You didn't lock in your supply prices. You were waiting for the market to drop. But since I just dumped the market, the price is about to triple. By tomorrow morning, your production costs will skyrocket. Your margins will vanish. You can't," Richard gasped. "That will tank my stock." "Yes," Sarah said. "It will probably drop to, single digits. $7? Maybe 6? She tapped the leather folder in her hand. "And when it hits $9, Clause 14B activates, and I own you." Richard stood up, knocking his chair over. "You planned this. You rigged it." "Business is war, Richard," Sarah said. She turned to walk away. "Who are you?" Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "Who the hell are you?" Sarah stopped at the door. She turned back. The lights of the onyx room cast a shadow over her face. "Jessica was right," she said softly. She lifted her left hand and rubbed the tiny scar on her thumb. "The stake was $45, Richard. You owe me." She walked out. Richard Sterling collapsed into the booth. Jessica put her head in her hands. The game was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The next morning, the sun rose over Chicago, indifferent to the chaos unfolding on the trading floor. At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell rang. Sterling Dynamics, SDY, opened at $42. At 9:35 a.m., the news broke. Major cobalt shortage reported in Asia. Supply chains for Sterling Dynamics paralyzed. Production halted indefinitely. At 9:45 a.m., the panic selling began. SDY, $28. Richard Sterling sat in his office, on the 42nd floor, the same office where he had built his empire. He was staring at the Bloomberg terminal, his face the color of ash. His phone was ringing investors, the board, the bank. He didn't answer. "It's a correction," he muttered to himself, rocking back and forth in his Herman Miller chair. "It's just a correction. It will bounce back." At 10:15 a.m., the second blow landed. A leaked report from an anonymous source, sent by Silas Graves, hit the wire services. SEC investigating Sterling Dynamics for offshore irregularities. Project Orion, under scrutiny. That was the kill shot. 15,000. Sty 11,50. Jessica Vane burst into the office. She wasn't wearing her usual immaculate suit. Her hair was messy, her eyes wide with terror. "Richard, the stock is free-falling. My options are worthless. You told me they were safe." "Shut up!" Richard screamed, throwing a crystal paperweight at the wall. It shattered, sending shards of glass across the expensive carpet. "Call the bank. Get a liquidity injection." "The bank isn't answering," Jessica yelled back. "They're calling the loan, Richard. They're freezing the accounts." At 11 a.m., the stock hit the magic number. SDY, $9. Richard's computer screen flashed red. A notification popped up from the legal department. Alert. Change of control provision triggered. Clause 14B active. The elevator doors to the executive suite slid open. They didn't open for Richard's assistant. They opened for security guards. Not Sterling security, Pellington security. And behind them walked Sarah. She wasn't wearing the severe suits or the dark makeup of Miss Hart anymore. She was wearing a simple white dress, clean and bright, with a lavender scarf. She looked like herself. She looked like Sarah. But she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge. Silas Graves walked beside her, carrying a single file folder. "Get out!" Richard roared, standing up. "This is my office. Security. Get them out." "Actually," Silas said, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel, "as of 3 minutes ago, Pellington Trust owns 51% of Sterling Dynamics. This is Miss Hart's office. You are trespassing. Richard slumped back into his chair. He looked at Sarah. You did this. You destroyed everything I built. You didn't build it, Richard, Sarah said softly, walking over to the window. She looked out at the city, the same view she had looked at the night he kicked her out. You stole it. You stole ideas from your engineers. You stole credit from your partners. And you stole 10 years of my life. I gave you everything, Richard spat. I gave you a penthouse. I gave you a life. You gave me a fake ring and an empty bank account, Sarah corrected him. She turned to face him. Do you remember the receipt, Richard? $45 for a ribeye steak? That was the price you put on my dignity. She reached into her purse. She pulled out the crumpled, faded receipt she had kept for 6 months. She placed it gently on his mahogany desk. Here is your receipt, Richard. Paid in full. Jessica, seeing the writing on the wall, backed away from Richard. Sarah, Jessica said, her voice trembling, trying to summon a smile. Sarah, listen. I didn't know. He told me you were crazy. He told me. Sarah held up a hand. She didn't even look at Jessica. Jessica, Sarah said, sounding bored. Do you remember what you said to me? Power attracts power. You were right. She gestured to the door. You have 5 minutes to clear your desk. If you're still in the building after that, the security team will escort you out. And Jessica, I'm canceling your company credit card. Good luck with the Uber. Jessica looked at Richard, then at the powerful woman standing by the window. She made a calculation. Richard was finished. You're a monster, Richard, Jessica sneered, grabbing her purse. She didn't look back as she ran for the elevator. Richard was alone. What happens now? He whispered. Are you going to send me to jail? The SEC might, Sarah said. The FBI certainly will when they see the Orion files. But that's not my concern. My concern is this company. She leaned over the desk. You are fired, Richard. For gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty, you have no severance package. Your stock is frozen. And since you used your penthouse as collateral for the loan, I own that too. Richard's eyes went wide. My home? My home, Sarah corrected. I'm going to renovate. I never liked that leather sofa anyway. She pressed the intercom button on the desk. Security? Mr. Sterling is leaving. Please ensure he takes nothing but his personal coat and check his pockets. 2 large guards stepped forward. They hoisted Richard up by his arms. He didn't fight. He was too broken. As they dragged him toward the elevator, he looked back at Sarah one last time. Why, he croaked, why go this far? You could have just taken the money. Sarah looked at him, her eyes clear and free of hate. Finally, because, Richard, she said, Arthur Pellington taught me something. Character is what you do when you think no one is watching. You watched me starve. Now, I'm watching you leave. The elevator doors closed. The office was quiet. The phone stopped ringing. Silas had unplugged it. Sarah walked over to the chair, Richard's chair, and sat down. It was too big for her. It smelled of his cologne. Burn the chair, she said to Silas, and get me a new one. Something comfortable. Silas smiled, a genuine, warm smile. It is already ordered, Miss Hart, along with a new nameplate for the door. What will it say? Sarah asked. Sarah Hart, Silas said. CEO. Sarah turned the chair to face the window. The rain had started to fall over Chicago, washing the glass. But this time, she wasn't standing out in it. She was inside, warm, safe, and powerful. She took a deep breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band, the one she had bought for herself at a pawn shop yesterday. Real gold. Solid, unbreakable. She slipped it on her finger. Let's get to work, Silas, she said. We have a company to rebuild. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how Sarah Hart went from a discarded wife with $45 to her name to the CEO of the very empire that tried to destroy her. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming her value when the world told her she was worthless. Richard Sterling learned the hard way that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting, it's the one listening, waiting, and preparing. Now, I have a question for you. If you were Sarah, would you have taken the high road and walked away with the money? Or was her revenge exactly what Richard deserved? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more real-life drama storytelling like this, every week, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a twist. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you step on today. They might own your world tomorrow.